Scooby Doo is one of the most popular and valuable media franchises of all time, and you don't really need me to tell you that. Sure, it's no Pokemon with its $77 billion in revenue since 1996, or Star Wars with its $52 billion since 1977. But since Mystery Incorporated's first appearance in September of 1969, the franchise as a whole has made over $3 billion from its 15 television shows and 46 films. Not to mention all the video games, comic books, TV specials, crossover episodes, and the avalanche of Scooby Doo merchandise. And even without all of the numbers to back up my point, you still don't need me to tell you how popular Scooby Doo is, because no matter who you are, you've probably seen some of it. Everyone loves a little Scooby Doo, and two randomly chosen people will likely have two completely different favorite pieces of the Scooby Doo universe. I personally am a pup named Scooby Doo guy, because it makes me so nostalgic for the times when I would stay home from school sick and watch reruns in the early 2000s. But if you turn on those live-action James Gunn movies, my butt is going to be on that couch for every one of those 86 minutes. If you ask my dad, he'd say that his favorite is the original Scooby Doo Where Are You show that he grew up on in the 70s. And I'm sure that there are like 10 people out there who are still watching Scoob, but this isn't really a video about the entire franchise as a whole. For me at least, Billiam's series reviewing all of the television shows, and Jello Apocalypse's video reviewing all of the character archetypes in Mystery Incorporated are the definitive pieces of Scooby-Doo review content on the entire internet. And I've added links to both of those in the description. Anything I really say about the franchise in a macroscopic sense is just going to be rehashing all of those talking points, and that's not really what I'm here to do. People like Scooby-Doo, they always have, and they likely always will. What this video is about, though, is a much less talked about, but to me, much more fascinating piece of the franchise's history. And that is the very first Scooby-Doo comic book. Initially, my idea for this video was to take a fond look back at the first non-television piece of Scooby-Doo fiction, which was produced in an era where they were largely still experimenting with some of the formula and character archetypes that would go on to define the franchise as a whole. But in doing so, I couldn't have imagined the rabbit hole that I would eventually go down. Once I started to realize just how many pieces of this story were missing, and how if I wanted them filled, the work was largely going to be up to me. I would have to become a one-man Mystery Incorporated myself, digging through the clues to uncover the lost pieces of this Scooby-Doo puzzle. And trust me, we will get to that part of the story. But first, I think that it would be helpful to talk about how franchise comic books get made in the first place, which will inform how this one came to be. Oftentimes, when a television or movie or video game or merchandise property becomes super popular, the first instinct of the creative team is to think about ways that they could capitalize on this initial success and continue creating content set in this universe. But you have to remember that many of these properties took years to make, and oftentimes many more years on top of that, workshopping the idea and trying to find anyone who would even make the thing. Even in the most extreme cases, like in the MCU, they can usually only pump out about 3 or 4 movies without straining their budgets and creative teams, which they already seem to be doing at this level of output anyways. What most had found by the 70s and 80s was that a serialized print publication was the logical next step in building off of an initially successful IP. Not only was it cheaper and faster to make, but oftentimes you could pull off high concept visual ideas much more easily, as long as you got illustrators and inkers with enough talent and vision. When you think about how much revolutionary and backbreaking work went into producing the visual effects for the first 1977 Star Wars film, it's clear that if Lucasfilm wanted to produce serialized Star Wars content, the best medium at the time was good old-fashioned pencils and ink. As this formula of expanding large franchise IP through the medium of comic books really started to take off, it's no wonder that it seems like nearly every franchise has had a comic book at one point or another. Sometimes it's to build a universe off of a super popular toy line, like in the case of Transformers or G.I. Joe. Other times it's to create canon stories to expand on the original one, or a tie-in story to read in anticipation for upcoming source material. I keep bringing up Star Wars, but it's such a good example, because if you put yourself in the shoes of a 12-year-old in the 70s, if you wanted to experience more Star Wars, you could just watch the VHS again and again and again while you wait for The Empire Strikes Back to come out in 3 years, or you could just read the monthly Marvel comic where Luke and his friends are still out there having adventures. And this is a perfect segue segue into the Scooby Doo comic books because initially they operated in much the same way. If you consider the release timing, the first season of Scooby Doo Where Are You aired from September of 1969 to January of 1970. The second and final season of the show didn't start up again until September of 1970 and ran a much smaller slate of new episodes before ending the following month in October. Within the next 5 years, we'd get 2 additional Scooby Doo shows, one running from September of 1972 through October of 1973, and the third not even beginning until 1976. Now you'll notice that there were some gaps there, but the most important one was from January to September of 1970, after the first season finished airing, but before the second one started. How can we keep Scooby Doo at the forefront of our fans' minds while we prepare the second season for syndication? Well, let's just make a comic book. The first issue hit shelves in March of 1970, bearing the same name as the original television show and being published by Gold Key Comics, a publisher that had produced other Hanna-Barbera spin-off comics for a number of years. The book would run for 16 issues before changing its name to Scooby Doo Mystery Comics at issue 17, and running until its 30th issue, which was published in February of 1975. The series was initially conceived as a format to republish the initial stories told during the first season of the television show, but that headline version is not entirely true. You'd think that with 16 issues and 16 episodes in season 1, it would be a no-brainer to assume that each issue of the comic book adapted exactly 1 episode from season 1, but that wasn't really the case. In fact, only 10 issues out of 30 total adapted an episode from the television show, with the earliest original story appearing as early as issue 2. By issue 11, the comic had switched entirely to telling only original stories outside of the television show, which was 6 issues before the name change at issue 17. When I started to do my research and get all of my ducks in a row, the path forward seemed pretty clear. Okay, we have 30 issues published over 5 years, where a third of the issues are adapted from material that I've already seen. This will be a fun little retrospective where I read through some of these early stories and point out anything fun I find or any differences I note, and comment on some of my favorite original stories and villains. But that was easier said than done. You see, even though the first 16 issues were available to read on the Internet Archive, the first hurdle that I came across when I tried to move on to reading issues 17 to 30, under the name of Scooby Doo Mystery Comics, was that there didn't appear to be any complete set of issues anywhere I looked. But from the collection that I was able to cobble together, I found that issues 19 to 21, 24 to 26, and 27 were available from free user uploads on a free comics website, while issue 29 was uploaded to the Internet Archive as a set of images. Okay, not bad. But you'll notice that issues 17, 18, 22, 23, 28, and 30 are nowhere to be found. They're still out there on the loose, and that baffled me. How could there just be nothing? No collected editions, no scans? Not even an uploaded image. So I knew that if I wanted to read the original Scooby Doo comic book in its entirety, I had my work cut out for me. The first place that my journey took me was to Scooby Doo Collected Comics Volume 1, which was a CD-ROM released in 2009 that collected many of the early comic book stories. After doing some digging, I found that this CD collected the first 20 issues of the Scooby Doo Where Are You comic book, which means that it contained PDFs for issues 17 and 18. There were a few used copies being sold on Amazon, so I nabbed one for a few bucks. With the CD on its way and issues 17 and 18 checked off the list, I turned my gaze to the ones that I had left, issues 22, 23, 28, and 30. But as I looked and looked, the truth finally settled on my shoulders. There are no readable versions of these comic books that exist on the internet outside of their physical form. Unless you have your hands on a physical issue from the early 70s, then for all intents and purposes, these 4 chapters are lost media. So the only way forward was clear. I had to get my hands on these things. Now, normally, I'm not somebody who would spend more than $10 on a used comic book, more so because I know that I'll get way more joy out of using that money on a new comic book rather than having some expensive collectible that will just sit in a box under my bed. But with a situation like this, I was willing to do whatever it took, because getting my hands on this stuff would mean that it was completing a lost piece of Scooby-Doo history. Luckily for me, I was able to find physical copies of issues 22, 28, and 30 on eBay. More so because I imagine that the people selling them didn't really even know what they had. But the final obstacle that I came up against in trying to complete this story was issue 23. No matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find a single copy being sold online. I looked and I looked and I looked, searching Google every day for a week to try and find a listing, but there were none, at least at the time of making this video. Issue 23 was just gone. At this point, I was just ready to throw in the towel. I mean, hey, we got 29 out of 30 issues. I can upload what I have to the Internet Archive and be done with it, and the missing issue 23 can just be this little poetic cherry on top of the whole thing. We almost got it, but there's still one more out there to keep the mystery alive. That was, of course, until I looked at the Scoobypedia page for issue 23. Yes, the Wikipedia for Scooby Doo is called Scoobypedia, and I love it. And on the Scoobypedia page, I found that the two stories were reprinted only once, and that was in Hanna-Barbera's Scooby Doo Annual of 1985. Even now, I can find essentially no information about this annual besides the fact that it exists. But what I did find was a used copy on Abe Books, and for $4, it could ship to me from the UK. No cover image, no item description, just a name. But I knew that if there was even a 1% chance, I had to take it. And with this final order, all of the pieces of the puzzle were on their way. And about a week ago, they all arrived. What fascinates me the most out of all of these pieces of media is the 1985 annual, which is not at all what I expected. It's essentially a hardcover children's picture book with short stories and fun games and puzzles scattered throughout. But I'm sure that to fill space, the publisher just included some reprints of randomly selected comic books, which at that time would be classics over a decade old. The ones they included happened to be the ones from issue 23. And while these aren't the original prints, I was so excited because in my hands right now is one of the last available physical copies of one of the rarest Scooby-Doo comic books in history. And I think that's pretty cool. But considering that I'm a zillennial in his late 20s, of course I don't own a scanner or a printer or a computer with a CD drive. So the final step of this whole process was to just hit up the public library. I packed my backpack and started my trek downtown since I only live a few blocks away from the library. And I enjoyed that beautiful, sunny, warm weather of Iowa in March. Once I got to the library, the process was pretty straightforward, if only a bit repetitive, since I had to scan each individual page into PDF form and shoot them off to my email in small bite-sized files. Once I was done, I got to work on the CD-ROM, which was the easiest part of the whole process, mostly because issues 17 and 18 were already packaged into neat PDFs. But if you're a Scooby-Doo fan who wanted even more out of their CD experience than just silly old comic books, then never fear, because the classic comics CD had plenty of fun extras to explore, like character bios and printable coloring book pages and puzzles. Not to brag or anything, but I beat this maze in just under half an hour. After reading the bios, I can confirm that Fred has in fact already written his own biography at the age of 16. Daphne's rich father is the one who finances all of the gang's high-tech gear, and Scooby-Doo is 7 years old, which makes him 62 in human years. Thanks, I hate it. But after digitizing everything, there was really nothing left to do but just upload them to the Internet Archive. And that's where they sit right now. I've added a link in the description if you want to go check them out. But as I kicked up my feet to bask in my victory, to enjoy the spoils of my Scooby-Doo journey, there was still one last thing that was bugging me and didn't quite sit right with me. The fact that no one really knows who wrote and illustrated these comic books. That information, like a copy of issue 23, seemed lost to the wind. There were a few breadcrumbs to chase down, of course, but most of them ended up fizzling out into nothing. You see, over the years, Gold Key Comics was sold and resold, acquired and reacquired, and the copyright has passed through multiple sets of hands by now. Any raw information I went searching for was likely going to lead nowhere, because any files or prints or records from those days have probably been lost or destroyed over the years. The only lead that I had to go off of was that cartoonist Dan Spiegel had illustrated some of the back half of the series, and that famous comics writer and journalist Mark Avenir had joined as writer somewhere in the early 20s. But that was only the result of some deep, vague Wikipedia information. Again, like issue 23, I was ready to pack it all in. Maybe this was just another part of the story that we'd never know. But there was one last thing I wanted to try. Unlike some of the other Hanna-Barbera cartoonists who were middle-aged or older in the 1970s, Mark Avenir is still around. He's 71 and still publishes a weekly pop culture blog on his website, which I've linked below. So I just figured, why not ask him? I imagine that it would be a shot in the dark, and depending on how full his schedule was, it might be weeks until he gets back to me, if he ever gets back to me. But to my surprise, the very next morning, I awoke to a response from Mark, and this email provided me all of the remaining information that I needed, and the final piece of the puzzle slid into place. Writers included Don R. Christensen, Vic Lockman, Alpine Harper, Cecil Beard, and Mark himself. Illustrations were provided by Phil DeLaura, Jack Manning, Warren Tufts, and Dan Spiegel, who drew issues 14 to 30. I went ahead and added that information to the Scoobypedia page so that we can now finally have a consolidated, official, public place where that information can be found. Mark Avenir was instrumental in this process, and I really just can't sing his praises enough. Feel free to check out his blog or go read some of the work he's produced over a storied career as a comic book writer. He really deserves all the accolades that he's given. But at this point, I was pretty satisfied. I tracked down all the lost stories of the first Scooby Doo comic book. I got my hands on them, digitized them, and filled in the missing creative credits that hadn't been noted anywhere in over 5 decades. And I feel pretty good. And after all that, there's really not much else to say. The original conceit of this video was to talk about the actual content in the comic books, but all that feels kind of small in comparison to the quest that I just went on. In reading all 30 of these issues, I still had a great time. It was fun to note some of the early differences, like how the mystery machine is pink instead of blue, or how we now know all of the gang's astrological signs, which is fun, I guess. There was some really fun monster design, like this lava monster from issue 22. And I really enjoyed how some of these issues contain these little vignette stories that were really cute and showed the gang in very rare moments apart from solving mysteries. But in a case like this, the journey was far more important than the destination. At the end of the day, what started as a review of classic Scooby Doo comics turned into a treasure hunt across the entire internet to catalog media once thought lost to time. And I think this whole process made it apparent, at least to me, that some lost media may not be as lost as you initially think it is, as long as you can get creative and you're willing to put in the work. Oftentimes, some old physical media, as well as the information about it, just gets lost because no one's paying attention. In this case, these issues of Scooby Doo weren't going to be found unless someone like me had taken the time to look. And it just goes to show that while we think that we're in an era where every piece of information is available immediately at our fingertips, some of that information won't be there unless someone puts it there. And I guess that even if you aren't interested in reading these comic books like I did, the point is that now they'll always be there when and if you ever are. And I think that that's pretty cool. If you made it this far, I just want to say thank you so much for giving this video a watch. This project is something that I am incredibly proud of and so excited to share. And it means so much to me that there would be anyone out there who would be interested in a topic like this. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. Over on my channel, we talk about comic books and take deep dives into classic characters and just generally talk about fun modern stories that you should check out and read. If any of that sounds cool, then feel free to subscribe and come hang out. But until I see you next time, thanks for watching and have a good one.